the question I was always super curious about is, why did civilization start? I mean, people lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years perfectly happy without kings, without big government, without paying taxes, without, all this
Yeah.
civilization stuff. So what on earth caused them to change? That never, ever, ever occurs. There are no
Oh,
cases known to me of any person in ancient Mesopotamia attacking or killing anyone over religion. So maybe we should go back to that. There was this major, major, major problem around 2000 BC when the fields just got so salty and they had to like completely abandon that area. If you look at the Middle East today, not just Iraq, but also Iran, there are tremendous, tremendous salinity problems.
how do you know about so much about the lives of people that lived 4,000 years ago? How's that possible?
Yeah, actually, the problem is not that we don't have enough information. The problem is that we have too much.
Too
Because
much? Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East, but grew up in America, where I practiced patent law and later founded a startup based on my own inventions. And then I went on to my ultimate passion, history, its lessons, shocking surprises, wow moments, and its myths and mysteries. To deep dive into history, I go to the source. I interview scholars, 150 and counting, passionate and preeminent scholars who have spent decades researching primary sources and writing about history. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. My guest is Dr. Tanya Sharlach. She's a scholar of the ancient Middle East and has written and is currently writing several books on this subject. In this interview, we discuss the following: an ox of one's own, royal wives, and religion at the court of the Third Dynasty of Ur, a book that she worked on for 12 years. Women in ancient Middle East, including their property rights and rights in marriage, the rights and roles of royal women and powerful high priestesses. As for religion, did you know that there were no religious wars in ancient Mesopotamia? This is the age of polytheism, an age of religions of place. We'll talk about a god of sun and justice, and a goddess of Venus, war and sex, an ancient environmental catastrophe that ended religions and destroyed societies. Dr. Sharlach will tell us about an empire that may be important for answering this question: why did humans form civilizations? And she'll tell the story of one boastful king who seemed to have been endowed with superhuman powers. So, stay with me as Dr. Sharlach and I unravel the Middle East. Dr. Sharlach, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. We are here to talk about the women of ancient Middle East. But before we get started on that, can you please kind of situate our listeners in place and time?
Sure. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you so much for having me as a guest. I'm super flattered that you guys are interested in my work and in women in the ancient Middle East. So it's kind of confusing because there are a whole lot of different names for more or less the same place. So really what we're talking about is today southern Iraq. But when we talk about it in ancient times, there are different terms that we use. Sometimes we talk about it as Sumer. Sometimes we talk about it as Babylonia, or even southern Babylonia, or sometimes Mesopotamia, which is actually a Greek word that means the land between the two rivers. And they're really
Oh,
more or less the same
interesting.
thing, right?
Yeah.
So you'll hear me talk sometimes about Mesopotamia or Babylonia, but it really is just pretty much southern Iraq, south of Baghdad today. And the time period that I'm going to be talking about is about 4,000 years ago, which is roughly about 2100 to 2050 BC. And that's the lifespan of this one particular woman whose archive still survives today and can give us a lot of
How do
information.
you,
Oh, mhm.
I'm just, how do you know about so much about the lives of people that lived 4,000 years ago? How's that possible?
Yeah, actually, The problem is not that we don't have enough information. The problem is that we have too much.
Too
Because the
much?
thing is, the too much, too much.
Oh,
I know
wow.
that sounds weird. Yeah. So the thing is this, they wrote on in Mesopotamia on clay. And if you think about it, like even when you throw clay tablets away, they still survive. And so a lot of them were thrown away, like thrown into actually often like building sites. Because if you want a good foundation, you're going to put some rubble in there to make a layer for the mud bricks. And so that's how they would recycle often these tablets, but they're not destroyed, right? And so when an archaeologist or an
Wow.
illicit person who goes and loots sites to sell things on the art market, then what happens is they might find like 20 or 30,000 of these at once.
I'm sorry, did you say 20 to 30,000?
Yeah, at once. And so for this particular, like literally 40-year period, we have at least 120 to 150,000 tablets for that 40 or 50-year period. So that works out to be like about 40 a day. And there's even more in Iraq that have never been published or not yet found. So the problem is too much, not too
Oh,
little.
wow. Okay. First of
Yeah.
all, just could you clarify for me this 40-year period goes back
Uh-huh.
again to 4,000 years ago, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're going
Mm-hmm.
to, okay. Um, and we're going to talk about that more in the subsequent
Mm-hmm.
segments.
Sure.
But when you say 20 or 30,000 tablets, clay
Mm-hmm.
tablets in like
Yep.
one location at once, so this is not just royal edicts anymore. These are not, this almost sounds like as if like daily writing, or am I close to it?
Yeah, so they're all kinds of tablets from all kinds of periods, right? So there are much
Mm,
earlier tablets and those tend to be kind of in smaller amounts. Um, and then there's, later, like through the whole gamut of Mesopotamian history, between about 3,500 to about, I think the latest cuneiform tablet is like something AD.
AD. Oh, wow. Okay.
But really, more or less, we can sort of say down to the time of Alexander the Great, which is about 330 BC. So over that, like more than 3,000-year period that they're writing in cuneiform, we have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of cuneiform tablets of all different kinds. But when we're finding 20 or 30,000 at a time, that's like a big institution's financial
Yeah.
records usually. And
I'm
so
sorry.
that's kind of
Financial. Is that what you said?
financial records, yeah. And so like
These are like accounting books almost then.
yes, we do have what we call double entry accounts, like merchants accounts. We have laundry lists, we have tax records.
Oh
Um,
my
we
gosh.
have like who showed up for work, who ran away. So these are usually associated with temples, and we'll talk about the temples later, but the
Yeah.
temples were used not just like people would, like priests and stuff would go there and worship, but they had, like you can imagine the Vatican back in medieval history, they ran a lot of businesses too.
It was
And
a
so,
site of administration, a
right.
location. Yeah. Uh, I have this problem that I could ask 60 more questions on just this archaeological
Go ahead.
aspect of this.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I was very fascinated with as I was preparing for this conversation with you was religion.
Hmm.
Um, can you please just briefly explain uh, early Mesopotamian religion? And you mentioned the temple.
Hmm. Yeah, so obviously incredibly difficult to explain anyone's religion briefly, so I will try. So, I mean, obviously this is like way before the Abrahamic religions, right? So we're talking about the late third millennium. And so basically, just if we had to categorize it very broadly, we would say, of course, it's a polytheistic religion, poly, many, theos, gods, right? Many gods and goddesses. And these were sort of religions of place. Like if we were thinking about the big gods, like in Greece, you have the Olympians, right? And you can think about like how Athena comes from Athens, right?
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
Zeus comes from a different location. So it's similar, a completely different religious system, right? But it's similar in that each major town, each major city had its own like sort of major gods, right? And so, for instance, Babylon later on will have Marduk as its major god.
yeah.
That's a little bit later, but For instance, we have the goddess Ishtar, and she's at home in Uruk, right? And so that's her place. And she's the major goddess of that city. The god Shamash, the sun god, was the god of the town of Sippar in the north, right? And so that's his place. And each town has its own patron god. And that god wasn't alone in that town. That god had a spouse. So if it's a
Oh,
woman goddess who's the major god of a town, like Ishtar, right? Ishtar isn't a great example because she doesn't have a fixed spouse. But that goddess would then have a husband and divine children. And she would have, assistants, a vizier, and a hairdresser. Gods were considered to be in her circle. So you have kind of like their own. They imagine their gods. They conceive of them as having the same kind of organization that
yeah,
like
yeah,
a noble would have. But they also had divine duties. So Shamash is the sun god, and that means he does like justice, right? So anywhere
yeah,
in the world you have a justice problem, you would go to Shamash. Ishtar was in charge of war, which is interesting because she's a goddess, right? And also
yeah.
sex. And so anywhere that
I'm sorry.
there's,
So you said she was the goddess of war and sex?
yeah,
Okay.
very interesting combination.
It really
Um,
is.
and so anywhere that
And
you
it's a
have,
female god. It's a
yes,
goddess.
the goddess, yes.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And she's also associated with the Venus, the evening star. They didn't understand the difference between planets and stars. So a lot of the gods have astral aspects. Okay, so those are the main gods, right?
Uh-huh.
But then you also have the more minor gods. And so that might be, like an actual object in a temple, like a divine harp or something like that, or a drum.
Like
Or
an
you might,
idol or a statue of some sort.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or just like an actual like drum used for worship or something like that. They might
Wow.
consider that divine, or like a river, like the river ordeal, they would consider that divine, or like a gate or something like that. And
Dr.
then
Sharlach, I want to make
Mhm,
sure that I'm following you correctly here. So these are different gods in different parts of Mesopotamia,
mhm,
central and southern modern
mhm.
Iraq.
Right.
Are these different religions, in fact, or different manifestations of the same religion? Or does the word religion even make sense in this context that we're talking about? Are these local
Mhm.
cults? I'm not sure I'm using the right words to ask the question.
Yeah. Well, so this is super, super complex, right? So what is a religion back then,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So like religions today, you could talk about like religions of the book, right? Or
yeah.
scripture, or there's an organized sort of
Abrahamic
like,
religions and all of that.
there's an organized system, like you might have the Pope, and then you would follow that, right?
Yeah.
Um, or whatever it may be. But that's really anachronistic for these ancient cultures. They don't have scriptures. There's no sacred writings at
Hmm,
all in
hmm.
ancient Mesopotamia. And they don't have like one religious figure that organizes the whole thing. So we can look over the whole region, over the whole of what today is like Iraq and Syria and to some extent Iran, and say that they had very similar polytheistic systems, and that to some extent they're worshiping the same group of gods. Although sometimes, like in Syria, for instance, we know that Dagon is super, super important. He's not really worshipped in the south unless they're trying to make a political statement. Hey, I went up and conquered in the north, and Dagon was the god who allowed me to do that, which we do
I
see.
see. I see.
And
Um, a few minutes earlier, when you were talking about the temple, you said the location of the temple wasn't just for religious rites, and it was not just a theological center. They actually carried out administrative functions.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely, yes.
was religion and government intertwined in ancient Middle East?
Yes, absolutely. Um, so the thing about it is this: the idea of a sort of what we might consider a separation of church and state, or
Yeah,
a
yeah.
break between secular and sacred, is again not a concept that they could ever have conceived of. There are literary texts that tell us way, 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 way back in the sort of mists of time, the gods, the main gods,
Mhm.
were served by lower level gods. And those lower level gods got a little bit grumpy at this, and there's apparently like a work strike attested in the mythological texts. And to solve that
Gods go on
problem,
strike?
yeah, the gods go on strike. And to solve this problem, they then create humans. So the whole purpose of humans is to farm the fields and make the food to be able to feed the gods. The gods had to eat sumptuous meals 2 or 3 times a day, like really, really expensive, gorgeous, beautiful meals. Like sometimes because we have the records, right, of the payments. So we know that, for instance, they're sacrificing like 200 or 300 animals a year to serve just these meals. And there would have been beer and desserts and bread, and the gods would be fed and clothed, and all this. And this was the whole purpose of humanity. And the main person who was in charge of organizing this was the king, or more generally, the royal family. So he didn't necessarily have to pay for it exactly. There was obviously cost sharing because it
Yeah.
was hugely expensive. But he had to organize it, and if there was a gap, he had to personally fill in with his own money.
So there is no separation of church and state in
No,
this context.
absolutely not. No,
Yeah.
can't be.
This is a minor point, but you pique my curiosity. So when they bring all this food, this sumptuous food to the
Mhm.
temple, who's actually eating it?
Ah, um, they say that they believe that the god eats it. And so they're going to bring this ritually to the god and present it in almost like a banquet, right? And then the god or goddess eats spiritually, right? So they're going to leave it there, and the god or the goddess is going to partake of it in that sense. And then it will become leftovers. And what we know from texts is that if you're a clergy member or you're associated with the temple, some of these can even be like time sharing agreements. You're associated with the temple for a certain number of months. You have the right to take those quote leftovers home, and that's part of your payment.
Oh wow. Okay.
Mhm.
This is a good business. It almost sounds like a racket, right? People bring food and all sorts of stuff for the church, and they consume it. We'll be back after a short break to talk about women in ancient Middle East. We'll be right back. Dr. Sharlach, in the last segment we talked about religion, and I'm wondering, did women participate in religions of ancient Middle East?
Sure. I mean, women always participate in every religion, right? Religion
Yeah.
isn't just ever for men. Sometimes when people ask that question, what they really mean is, are clergy members only men, right?
Yeah.
And so
Thank you for clarifying. Actually, yeah, that's the real question, right?
Right. And so the answer is actually really, really interesting. Definitely not. There are a number of priestesses, as you might call it. And interestingly, where we get the most powerful priestesses, that is the women who are the chief officiant, right? So
I'm sorry,
each
chief of what?
officiant,
Oh, chief
um,
officiant. Okay.
yeah. So in other words, each god has a high priest or a high priestess, and that person is in charge of the most important aspects of their ritual duties, I guess.
Hmm.
And so they believed that the god or the goddess was, in a sense, married to the chief officiant. I mean, they had like an actual divine partner, but their human partner was their chief priest. And so, for obvious reasons, like a goddess is going to have a male chief priest, and a god is going to have a female chief priestess.
So a
Um,
god marries a human.
mhm.
Okay.
I mean, not you can't take it too literally. I mean, like they used to call nuns brides of Christ, right? So
Yeah.
um, I guess that sort of same idea of a very close relationship then, conceived of in some sense as a obviously unequal marriage. Yeah, so interestingly then it's not in the cults of the goddesses, right, that you have the priestesses, but in the cults of the gods. that you have the priestesses. And those were often actually daughters of the king, princesses. Their royal blood was considered to entitle them particularly to hold these very, very, very high offices. Royal
Wow.
sons could, of course, also hold that same
Did
position.
that preclude the royal sons and daughters from marrying later if they were married
Mhm.
to us? Yes,
Yes.
as in it.
Yes, so those high priests and priestesses, the word is the same. Sumerian is a gender neutral language, so it's the
Mm,
same word. It's a word called En. And the sons and the daughters who became En priests or priestesses, as we would call it, lived in the temple in a cloister, and they were not to be married.
I see. Is there a point in ancient Middle East history after which women no longer participated in the capacities that you just shared with us in
Mhm.
religion?
Yeah, so that particular role of end priest, of high priest or high priestess, that was a prince or a princess, that kind of in a way dies at the end of this period. Although there is an attempt by the later king Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe Nabonidus, I forget. Anyway, in the 6th century to revitalize it. They dig up Babylon and they find an old stele and they're like, oh, we need to do this again.
Mm.
But essentially, after about 2000 BC, that particular kind of priest or priestess is really no longer um, at all popular. There are other kinds of priestesses, kind of a little bit more parallel to nuns, in that there were like kind of groups of them and they would live together in cloisters. And we see that around the time of Hammurabi, around 1750, 1800 BC. But the reason that those early, that sort of end priest dies out is because the far southern part of Iraq has a massive climate crisis around 2000 BC. And as a result of that, most of the land becomes very rapidly too salty to farm and is abandoned. And because that the gods who had those particular kinds of end priests were almost all located in the south. When the South is abandoned, that kind of priesthood also falls away. So
Wow.
yes, there is a definite diminution of the roles of women, but it seems to be geographical rather than the basis of any sort of ideas in their head.
Climate crisis in ancient Middle East. Um, we're talking about diminution of women's status in religion. I'm wondering, did women enjoy property rights in ancient Middle East?
Um, yeah, so this is a really difficult question, right? Because the vast number of like people, both male and female, didn't own anything themselves. It was always like a household. If you think about like the Romans, the paterfamilias,
Hmm.
the male head of the household controls like the wealth and has legal rights over like the business and everything. And it was kind of similar back then. It's really the household, it's the family business. So like a daughter might not own much, but also a son wouldn't own much because it's going to be the father, the head of the household, who is running things, and everyone else is sort of partaking in that system.
Oh, that complicates the picture. Now you don't know who's okay. How about
Yeah.
matriarchies? Did matriarchies exist?
Well, there are women who can own property and certainly did own property and were
Okay.
quite wealthy. And this tended, of course, to be widows,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Because like the male head of the family dies, and sometimes the widow would get the money. And I mean, I say money, they didn't have coins back then, but you know what I mean, like the property and the business and the
The
house
state
and
and all of that. Yeah.
the wealth. And interestingly, we have a lot of cases where the widows, well, the man's children, the dead man's children, take the widow to court to try to seize the property. Now, we're not sure whether those are her kids, which would be a bit
Yeah.
disturbing,
Yeah.
or maybe like from a previous marriage or something.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of these cases. In one instance, we don't know what happened. We just have like the the record that she's being sued. But in one case, we do actually have the verdict. And we know that the widow actually won the court case. The judge ruled in her favor because it said that she bought the house with her own hand. So it was her own money. It wasn't
Mhm.
her husband's money, and therefore they had no claim on it.
Dr. Sharlach, I mean, this is your research, but do you realize how crazy this sounds? You're talking about a lawsuit from 4,000 years ago or so. And we talk about it as if it's like, 10 years ago. Just this is
Mhm.
fascinating how you have access to these records and have studied them. As we're talking about widows, which makes me think of uh, marriage rights. What rights did women have in marriage in ancient Middle East? For example, could they divorce?
Mhm. Um, yeah, okay. So you can divorce for various reasons, and what happens sort of, well, I mean, like today, right? I mean, like a no-fault divorce is very different from somebody who has like, five kids and one of the partners is cheating, right? So
Yeah.
um um, what ends up happening is what they want to do is protect the family, right? And so it's not going to be super easy to divorce for just not liking each other. I guess what you might call incompatibility, right? And so
Mhm.
what they say in the law cases is if the husband says he wants to divorce his wife because he hates her, right? Then he has to pay a pretty big fine, and that fine is proportional to the money paid at the marriage.
Hmm.
If the woman, however, says that she wants to divorce her husband because she just doesn't like him, then the law code at least says that what they do is they throw her in the river. Now, does this
Wow.
mean that like she drowns, or does this mean that they're trying to publicly humiliate her? I don't know. Um, but what they're definitely trying to do is keep divorce for no reason down.
I see.
Now, if the woman is drunk all the time, or she's wasting the property, or the man is cheating, or something like that, then obviously the penalties are different.
How about royalty? What kind of roles and powers could women in the royal family have at that time in ancient Middle East?
Yeah, so the royal family starts out like the normal families back then. And so the normal family, the rule was monogamy, one man, one wife, right? And
Mhm.
so although there was usually a considerable age difference between the bride, who might be like as young as 15, maybe like 15 to 20-ish, and the groom, who in a normal family would be about 25, 30. In the royal family, that could be very different. You could be very, very young and married off to like some princess from like a neighboring region, in order to solidify alliances.
Yeah.
Or in the case of Shulgi, you could be like 60 or something and marrying a really, really young girl. So you could have like a number of children that were significantly older than your current bride.
And Shulgi is a king that we're going to talk about subsequently.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's the normal thing. But what ends up happening is that the kings of this period want to be having lots and lots and lots and lots of children, in part to cement the possibilities for succession, but also because you need children to fill these priesthood positions and to run the army and all kinds of stuff. And so they're going to start to want to have like what we might call a harem. Now, you really can't legally do that. So they're going
so
to
is
have,
harem like a harem?
yeah. Mhm.
Okay. All right.
Um,
Why
and
can't you do that
so
legally? I thought
Well, because legally you can only marry one wife.
that only applied to the population. Is there not an
Uh,
exception for the royal family or anything like that?
well, this King Shulgi is going to make an exception. Um, uh, so I think legally he could only be married to his main wife. But you could then have consorts
Uh-huh.
who you aren't technically married to, but they live in your house and you acknowledge their children as your legitimate children.
And the consorts probably have some limited rights as well.
Hmm.
I see.
Right. It's not even really clear whether that's considered by them a marriage legally.
I see. Let's take a break here. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll actually talk more about royal wives and religions in one particular important dynasty of ancient Middle East. Dr. Sharlach, let's talk about your book, An Ox of One's Own, Royal Wives and Religion at the Court of the Third Dynasty of Ur. Um, in particular, what does your book tell us about the role of women in ancient Middle East?
Um, yeah, I really kind of struggled with that question because this is a book I worked on for like 12 years and
Wow.
now I have to like encapsulate it in one sentence. Um, So I think when I started looking at this archive in this book, what attracted me was that it was a quote woman's archive, that it had to do with a slice of life that we don't often see, right? Which is women's lives. And the title of the book, The Ox of One's Own, is based on, of course, of Virginia Woolf, The Room of One's Own, right? So the question that was kind of guiding me was did women have a religious space of their own? Did they have, like, was this her own stuff, right? Or is she like taking something from her husband? Um, did women have a room of their own to do their own religion? And of course, my hope was that they did. As I was working through the material of the book, though, it became, I think, a little bit clearer to me that at least the records that we have, being sort of official institutional records, they don't really show what she thought or what she hoped or what she wanted, or who owned necessarily the animals that are being sacrificed. And so, in a sense, it seems like the women are almost really more like pawns rather than actors, like
Huh.
various courtiers, various men, various members of the institutional household are kind of moving things along in
Yeah.
their name. Um, so we can see courtiers. For instance, there's this general named Nir Idigal, and he had kind of a lousy job well, it wasn't lousy, but he had kind of like this mid-level military job, and he obviously really wasn't satisfied with that. So he keeps kind of giving her gifts um, to her foundation. Here, I'll support you with this. And so obviously what he's doing is buying access. And then we can see that it works, right? Because he ends up getting these really rich benefits. And he ends up then promoted to be a general over 420 men. So in a sense, like courtiers and governors and various people who want things are trying to like use the women successfully to get them.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. And you have records on clay tablets for all of this.
Mhm.
That's just wow. Um, I'm I'm curious, why did you select the third dynasty of Ur as the focus of your research?
Mhm. Yeah. So starting in college, what really the question I was always super curious about is, why did civilization start? I mean, people lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years perfectly happy without kings, without big government, without paying taxes, without, all this
Yeah.
civilization stuff. So what on earth caused them to change? And of course that change then created then, like a domino effect, a ripple effect, and we're still why do we have 60 minutes and an hour? Well, because some Babylonian person counted up to 60 and stopped, and we're just still repeating it, right? So that was the question I'm still super, super interested in. So I want to know, like, the only way you can know why they had the civilization, why they had a state, is to look at what the state did for them.
Yeah.
Benefits did they get? But the early records are too fragmentary. And so this is really the first period for which we have so many records about what the state did.
Repeat for us, please,
Mhm.
the time period of the third dynasty of Ur, please.
The third dynasty of Ur, according to conventional dates, is 2112 to 2004 BC.
Okay,
Now, I wouldn't bet my life on those dates. I mean, are they? I mean, that's what scholars say it is, right? We could be 50 or 60 years off.
I see.
Yeah.
Um, we talked about a certain king, Shulgi.
Mm-hmm.
You actually mentioned it, and I said we would talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is he known for? He's a king in the third dynasty of Ur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he was a really interesting guy. So the Third Dynasty War is really pretty short, right? It's really only about a century. And it was his father who pretty much, I guess you could say put it on the map and really kind of centralized everything. And his father seems to have been a modest and efficient man. And he dies rather suddenly, quite young. And Shulgi will come to the throne probably pretty young and goes on to rule for 48 years. So
Wait,
he
that's a
didn't even just
long
attack,
time.
right? Long time. Um,
48 years, especially at
48
that
years.
time.
Yeah, and it's only at the end of his reign, like the last 15 years or so, at the end of his reign that we have his texts. Um, so just simply by length of reign, he's the most important. But he also was like super, super energetic. And he's like, oh, wait, things aren't working well. This town is doing this thing, and this town is doing that thing. And wait, the canals aren't right. And wait, we need a better building. And wait, I need to negotiate with this person. And so I better learn their language. And he also seems to have enjoyed like archery and running. And he makes all these like wild claims
I'm
that
sorry,
there's
did you
no
say running?
running. Yeah, he talks about stretching his thighs to run between the two capitals, Ur and Nippur, in
Is
a
this
single
like
day, which
is it
is
like long
completely
distance
impossible.
running?
Well, no. So the problem was that there was a really major festival that was celebrated in two different capitals on the same day, and there was no way for the king to be there on the same day. Like you can't be in two places at one time.
Yeah.
So what he actually does is he changes the calendar to have the local calendar run 1 month ahead so he can celebrate both. But in literature, what he says is that he was a speedy runner and he could run. But he seems to have been just like completely boastful. So he writes
Wow.
all these like crazy sounding texts. This is just a quote. Let me boast of what I have done. The fame of my power is spread far and wide. And he like claims to be able to like play it's like Annie gets your gun. I can play this musical instrument and I can do divination. Um, so we really get a sense of his character. Um, so he did do a lot of really impressive stuff. My guess is that being married to him was no picnic.
Why do you say that?
um, was just so over the top in his ego. And that's really unusual. Other Mesopotamian kings really never make these sort of bombastic claims.
Kind of reminds me of Emperor Nero. Wasn't it him who got all sorts of
Mhm.
musical accolades and festivals that he did not even participate in?
Yes, apparently his dying words is, "What a great artist dies in me."
Exactly, exactly. And this whole thing about him playing the flute or something while Rome burnt, that's not correct. But still, I mean, it goes to show how boastful he was about himself. You said being married to him was no picnic. In your book, the wife that you talk about is Shulgi Simti.
Mhm.
Well, first of all, is Simti a name or does it have a
Yeah, okay.
meaning?
So they had this tradition, like if you were this may even have happened for kings, but if you were a woman and you married a king or you became one of these end priest person things, you would change your name so that your name reflected your new status. So we don't know what her original name was. But when
Wait, you
she
mean you
becomes
entirely lose your birth name?
right, and you take then a
Oh,
royal name or a priestess name, something that reflects, like for instance, Shulgi's first wife, she came from what today we would call Syria, from a town called Mari.
uh-huh.
But when she gets engaged to the king, she's renamed I love Ur, or she loves Ur.
Okay.
And so Shulgi Simti, Shulgi obviously refers to Shulgi, right?
Yeah.
And Simti is this word that's a little hard to translate. It seems to mean like pride or treasure. And
Hmm.
so her name means my um depending exactly on how it is, but something like Shulgi is my treasure, or my treasure is Shulgi. So really essentially I sort of think of it as like kind of Shulgi's plaything.
Yeah.
Like that's the name that she's given, which is a little bit disturbing. Um,
To say the least. Yeah.
yeah. And so where she came from, nobody knows. The other royal women have like relatives who come to visit them. Sometimes they're related to various, neighboring localities. They may have been like even royal there or from noble families. She doesn't. She's completely alone there, and that makes her unusual. So my suspicion is that she's entering what you might call then through the back door, because we know the kings could choose concubines, like they would see a woman dancing or a performer or something like that. These weren't very respectable women in their view. They may even have been enslaved or foreign. And my guess, I don't know this, the texts don't tell us, but my guess is that she's coming from that kind of a background.
And then she sort of ascended the ranks to become an outright queen. Is that what happened?
Um, There's controversy as to whether she was queen. There are scholars who say that they think she was queen. She's never given the title queen on her official, her seal, her signet, if you will. She's given the title concubine, and in fact,
Oh,
what's called a road concubine. And so does that mean that she was taken on the road, or she's one of the ones who goes on the road? I don't know. But my book certainly suggests that another woman who was much, 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 much richer and more powerful, actually probably from Iran, a woman by the name of Ninkala was queen. And she does what the queen should do. She lives in the capital and she does the main sacrifices there.
yeah.
Whereas Shulgi Simti, she doesn't. She lives in a subsidiary palace. And in fact, when Shulgi dies, two people accompany him into his burial. We don't know exactly who those were. Shulgi Simti and another concubine disappear at exactly the same time. They weren't, from powerful families. They didn't have anybody who was going to ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my guess is that she's one of the women who's then sacrificed to accompany him in his grave.
When you say other wives of Shulgi
Mhm.
would have relatives come and visit, family come and visit, but that was not the case in the case of Shulgi Simti. How do you
Mhm.
know that? How do you, is it because there were no records of this?
Um, Yeah, okay. So I can't say like absence of evidence isn't evidence for
Yeah.
absence, right? So
Yeah.
we don't have all of these records for sure. We
Mhm.
can say in the records that we have that the other women have family members who come, and Shulgi doesn't. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't some tablet that we might find, 20 years from now
Yeah.
that would change our view.
Of
But
course.
at
Yeah.
the moment, she appears to really basically be the poorest and the least connected compared to at any given time, he had about 5 to 7 concubines and one main wife. Now his main wives keep dying, probably in childbirth.
Yeah.
So they change pretty often.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Sharlach as we get into the perspective. Dr. Sharlach, in a previous segment yesterday, you talked about uh, having too much information about ancient Middle East, and they're like, at a site at one time you may find 20 to 30,000 tablets. Um, I guess reviewing those in cuneiform could be a full-time job for anyone, maybe for several people.
Mhm.
What I'm wondering is, where do you see these tablets? How do you have access to them? Have you been to the Middle East? Are they at your university?
Mhm. Yeah, so Oklahoma State University does not own any cuneiform tablets. So basically the the tablets that I study have been scattered because they weren't dug officially by an excavation. They were dug a long time ago, probably, in the 1920s or something, and sold.
Hmm.
And so like you might have a couple of them that are like literally in somebody's shoebox or something like that, right? And they eventually make their way into museums, or museums might have bought quite a number of them. So there's a whole bit of reconstructing the archives. A lot of that now is put online. There are some people at UCLA and Oxford who do that, as well as in Spain. So a lot of my materials, that's super, super useful because you can put in search terms, you can put in people's names and try to reconstruct the archive that way. So that's a huge help. But we also still have to read tablets that have never been translated. So for the purpose of this book, I was able to go to the Yale Babylonian collection, and they very kindly allowed me to publish parts of their collection related to this woman's archive that had never been worked on before.
Um, do you read the translations or do you read the original cuneiform text?
Um, yeah, so like when you go to Yale, you pull open a drawer and like there are the tablets that nobody has ever.
Wow.
So you translate them yourself. Um, as for the things that are available online, they're usually put up with like people will scan the actual tablet and then they'll write out what we call a transliteration, which is because these are like syllables or pictographs, right? So they're not like translated, but people have put down what it said in the language that it was written in Sumerian. And then you can look at the picture and just confirm that yes, that is also,
Yeah.
your reading of
Yeah.
the text.
So do you have any upcoming projects, writings that you want to share with us?
Um, yeah, so when I finished this book, I got really curious about this woman's kids. As a mother myself, I was like, oh, okay, so, well, because my suspicion was that for these royal women, often their status is related not just to their family, and their standing with their husband, but to their kids, like whose kids are rising up, who's the
Yeah.
crown
Yeah.
prince. Yeah. So I wrote an article about their kids. Unfortunately, we can't tell whose kids were what because they would never say, well, this mother produced these kids. They would just say they're all kids of Shulgi.
Yeah.
And then I decided to try to go back to some issues that I've been working on for a while, a little bit less with the women and a little bit more with the idea of climate change. I think I mentioned earlier that there was this major, major, major problem around 2000 BC when the fields just got so salty and they had to like completely abandon that area. If you look at the Middle East today, not just Iraq, but also Iran, there are tremendous, tremendous salinity problems. And it strikes me that looking to the past to see what they did in response to the early phases of this crisis might actually, help people maybe know what not to do, right?
Yeah.
But also just to know that these problems have been faced before. So the current work that I'm doing is on those salinity problems and on it looks like what they're actually doing when the fields are getting just right at the beginning too salty is they're draining the marshes to try to get new land, which of course then is
Becomes a whole
terrible.
different issue.
It's
Yeah.
awful, and really contributes to the problem. So that's the work that I'm working
Are you
on
going to
now.
turn that into a book?
I'm not sure. There's a book, my first book is on taxation. That was my dissertation. And my second book is on religion. I think my third book, which I'm sort of working on, is a wider look at taxation and how taxation evolves. Not just the third dynasty of Ur, but pulling it a little deeper into time and a little further back.
Yeah.
I'm also working on that as well.
Are there any lessons from religions of ancient Middle East for our modern times? You talk about stretching now. I'm stretching us back
Mhm.
from now, back all the way to then.
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, I would say like these are not really necessarily living traditions, right? So it's kind of hard to answer that. But what I would say is that in modern times, it seems like we see so many examples of people killing each other over nationality or religion. If
Yeah.
you look in the ancient past, when you have these religions of places, that never, ever, ever occurs. There are no
Oh,
cases known to me of any person in ancient Mesopotamia attacking or killing anyone over religion. So maybe we should go back to that.
what? Seriously? I find that incredible.
I mean, I'm not saying they didn't go to war, they did, but not over religion.
That's, in Europe, in the Middle East, this
Mhm.
this happened all the time for
Mhm.
centuries on.
Mhm.
Do you have a reason for that? Why it didn't happen in ancient Middle East?
A lot of scholars have written a lot about it and nobody really has an answer. So, maybe the next generation of historians coming up can
Yeah,
take this and run with it and we can make progress.
I'm
But
so
I think it's
glad
very interesting.
it is. I'm so glad I asked that question. I would have never thought of it that way. Are there any lessons from women of ancient Middle East for our modern times?
Um, I guess just sort of going back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, when I started, I wanted this to be something that it wasn't. I wanted this to be a really inspiring and empowering story of women's freedom to choose their own religion. And that really wasn't what I found at
Yeah.
all. This woman, I think, was able to make some choices, but in a lot of cases, choices are made for her. And she then has to negotiate power carefully within that context. She doesn't have the full freedom to just go forward and do whatever it is that she wants.
She
So
has the
it
confines of her life already like set to some extent. Now she has to navigate at the borders to see how far she can go, right?
right. But on the other hand, um, I think that if it is really true that she's somebody who came from maybe even, like a different place, or certainly from a different class than most of the women in the royal family, she got really high, right? She did
Yeah.
have a lot of influence. And so maybe, I guess, to me, the story of her life is just kind of complicated. And maybe that's the lesson, right? Today, a lot of women have complicated lives. We have so many powers and roles that, previous generations of women didn't have, but then that also puts a lot of pressure on women that they maybe didn't have a couple generations ago. So maybe we need to embrace that complexity and see that it was also present for women back then.
That's a good point. Dr. Sharlach, thank you for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.